Hello everyone and welcome to this tutorial for the PMDG Boeing 737. I'm Emmanuel, I'm a Boeing 737 pilot and a member of PMDG's tech team. In this video I'm going to show you the pre-flight procedure of the 737 next generation aircraft. If you have not yet watched the tutorials number 1 and 3 on the electrical power-up and the FMC pre-flight, then please go ahead and watch them now, as we are this tutorial is based on the previous two tutorials. Starting off with the pre-flight procedure, the first thing we're going to do is the light test, making sure that all the bulbs are working. And while we're doing the light test, we are following a certain panel scan procedure. So let me quickly describe the scan flow in the 737 flight deck. Starting at the overhead, we have the upper overhead panel where we're just going through from the right to the left, making sure that all the lights work. And then you can see that the main overhead panel is divided into 5 different sections, going up to down. And we are following this particular scan flow from the overhead panel, making sure that all the lights are working. And later on, the pre-flight procedure itself is also based on the very same scan flow. So if you follow this flow, then you will basically always stay within the set limits of the description that Boeing gave. And that makes it easier not to miss anything, rather than if you are going randomly over the different parts of the flight deck. So simply follow my mouse. While you're doing while you're checking the lights, make sure that these are actually not illuminated. They have their separate test switches, and the same goes for the wheel well light, for the wheel well firelight up here. So those are not supposed to illuminate. The rest of them is supposed to illuminate. Next off, make sure that the sun visor is in the flight deck. Now, on the release version there is no sun visor included, but it might be added with a later update to the PMDG. So, depending on the time when you're watching this, this might or might not have a sun visor in the flight deck. Next we're going to test the oxygen. First, you press the test button and watch for the yellow cross to illuminate, like this. And then you press the red button in here and keep it held down for 5 seconds. And then watch the oxygen pressure gauge up here, making sure that the pressure is not dropping by more than 100 psi while you are conducting the test. From there we are moving on to the Efis control panel. Now you want to set something that's appropriate for your departure here. Mostly I'm using a range of 10 miles, make sure that the traffic is turned on, terrain overlay is on, the airport display is on. Set the baro selector to whichever unit of measurement is used in the country where you are. Since we are in the United Kingdom, we're going to use hectopascals. Make sure that the QNH is set correctly. On today's flight it's going to be 1013. And use the minimum selector to set the minimum flap retraction altitude, the MFRA. We will determine the correct MFRA later on during the final CDU pre-flight procedure. But for now we'll just set something that's 1,000 feet above the airfield elevation. And this is the altitude at which you would accelerate in case you have an engine failure on your takeoff. One thing to be very sure of is that the weather radar is not turned on. I'm quickly going to show you what it looks like. So here, if you have the weather indication, make sure to switch it to terrain, so that you see terrain over here. The weather radar can harm people in front of your aircraft, both in the terminal as well as in the pushback truck over here, maybe people walking in front there. And as a slight simplification for flight simulation purposes, we are just also going to set the right Efis control panel here as well. From there, we can quickly check the clock, and very important, make sure that it's showing UTC over here and not manual. If it's showing manual, just press the time date button again until it's showing UTC. And make sure the nose wheel steering switch is guarded. From here on, let's move up to the overhead panel, and from here on we're going to follow the scan flow pattern that I talked about earlier. The flight control switches are guarded, the spoiler switches are guarded, the alternate flap extension is guarded as well, and the switch is in the off position. None of these lights should be illuminated now, and we'll turn the yaw damper on and observe the yaw damper light extinguishing as well. The navigation transfer and display switches are all in the middle position, and the source switch is in the auto position. This is a little easier to see if you just move your view exactly underneath the panel. Alright, from here we are moving on to the fuel. The engine valve and spar valves should be illuminated in the dim position, not in bright. So in the dim position. We are going to check the crossfeed valve's operation, so move the switch. Look how it's illuminating bright, then dim. And the reverse is true when we are closing the crossfeed valve again, it goes bright, then off. And when this is going off, you just want to test the bulb once again. Make sure that the bulb is still illuminating. And this is because the light is tied to the same circuit breaker as the actual crossfeed valve. So if something goes wrong while the valve is in transit and the circuit breaker pops, then the light would extinguish as well, making it look like it would have closed normally, while in fact the valve may still be in a transit position and allow fuel from one side to flow to the other. Next off, we're going to turn on any fuel pump for tanks in which there is fuel. So we have fuel in the center tanks here, so we're going to turn on all four, in the wing tanks of course, so we are going to turn on all four wing tank pumps, and if we had more than 453 kilos in the center tank, we would also turn on the center tank fuel pumps. If there's less than 453 kilos, or 1000 pounds, in the center tank, then don't turn on the center tank fuel pumps in the pre-flight procedure. Otherwise, the low pressure light might illuminate during your taxi or takeoff. And if it happens during the takeoff below 80 knots and you see master caution coming on, you would have to reject the takeoff. So that's the reason why we're keeping those pumps off. If there's less than 453 kilos or 1000 pounds in the center tank. Next, moving to the electrical panel, make sure the battery switch is guarded and the galley power and the IFE power, if you are flying a longer bodied aircraft type that has the IFE switch over here, that they are both turned on. The switches over here are all guarded, the standby power switch as well as the IDG disconnect switches. And on the generator control panel, all you can do is make sure that the bus transfer switch is guarded, the wiper is set to park. Moving on to the middle, set the lights as required. The equipment cooling is both in normal. Note that with the equipment cooling, those switches are oriented in opposite direction to the rest of the switches in the flight deck. Normally, them being forward means them being in the normal position, or in the middle, but those are actually the reverse way. So those, we can see it over here, the normal position is the up position. Moving on, emergency exit lights are guarded. The fasten seatbelt sign can be turned on as soon as refueling is complete. We see that we've got the fueling complete here, so we're going to turn the fasten belt switch on, and the wiper is set to park. Moving on to the next part of the panel, we are going to turn the window heat switches on, and observe the lights coming on after a short time. The probe heat switches are remaining in auto unless the outside air temperature is 3 degrees or less and there is visible precipitation, like rain or snow or dense fog. If both of these conditions are met, so visible precipitation and the temperature of 3 degrees or less, we are turning the probe heat switches on the ground, since we are then in icing conditions and we don't want any ice to form on any of the probes or the ports that are being heated here. So in that case we would turn the switches on. Otherwise we're going to keep them in auto or in off depending on what's installed in the aircraft you are flying. The anti-ice switches are all three off. Hydraulics, all 4 pump switches are turned on, and make sure that only the low pressure lights of the engine pumps are illuminated here. The overheat and low pressure lights of the electric pumps are extinguished. There is nothing to test on the voice recorder panel. I see some people doing the test all the time, but that's purely a maintenance function. You don't need to touch that as a pilot. Next up, the differential pressure is going to be 0 since we're on the ground, and the cabin altitude is going to indicate the ground level. So that's about 300 feet over here, hidden beneath the other needle. And the cabin rate of climb is supposed to be 0. Moving up here, with the temperature selector, we can select if we want to see the supply duct or the passenger cabin temperature. We want to see the passenger cabin, of course, and not what's in the duct. The duct is basically a maintenance function, even though some pilots are using it and are swearing that the duct temperature is what the passengers are feeling, but Boeing's guidance is clearly it should be on the passenger cabin. If you're flying a longer bodied aircraft like the 800 or 900, there will be several positions on the selector, so make sure that it's either set to the forward or the aft cabin. That's either the position going straight up or slightly to the right. Make sure the temperature selectors are set correctly. In the 700, usually setting it to A is about fine. The flight deck temperature you can just leave in the middle position and adjust it as you feel it. If you're flying a longer bodied aircraft like the 800 or 900, you have 3 selectors over here. The flight deck can basically be set to whatever is appropriate to your liking. And be aware it's not marked flight deck, it's actually marked cont cabin, for a reason that's probably nobody except for the Boeing engineers understands. Then in the 800 or 900 you have a forward cabin and an aft cabin. So basically, if you have all those 3 selectors on the 800 or 900, you would set the cont cabin to A. So the switch pointing at A like this. You would set the forward cabin to U like this, and the aft cabin to T like this. And that is basically giving you a good temperature distribution throughout the whole aircraft. One word on that, if I may. The air conditioning system in the 737 is still pretty much like the original 1960s system, and let's put it that way, it works as good as an air conditioning system in a 1960s car. If you're saying that there were no air conditioning systems in 1960s cars, then you're totally right. Now go figure what that means for the airplane. Recirculation fans, they should be on. On the 700, 600 you only have one. In the 800, 900 you have a second recirculation fan over here that's also supposed to be in the auto position. Next up, we're going to set the air conditioning packs to auto, make sure the isolation valve is open, engine bleeds are both on, and the APU bleed is off. We're going to set the cruise altitude on the cabin pressure computer, so the flight altitude here is your estimated cruise level, 340 for this flight. If there were any step climbs planned on your flights, you would set it to the highest level planned for your flight. The landing altitude is going to be the elevation in Dublin, so at our destination, that's 250 feet. You can get that from the flight plan, or you can also apply a little trick over there. That is, if you look at the flight management computer, and you look at the altitude shown here on the runway waypoint, that is the destination airfield elevation plus 50 feet. So 292 minus 50 makes 242 feet elevation in Dublin. So 250 is the value we're going to select here. The pressurization mode selector is in auto, and make sure that there is no alternate or manual light illuminated up here. So if it was in manual it would look like this, or an alternate. Make sure those are not illuminated. You want this one to be in auto. Again, this is a vital life support system, the pressurization system, so make sure you are carefully setting this correctly. Looking at the lights, we will have all lights off except for the position light that's in steady. And if it was dark outside, you would put the logo and the wheel well lights on. The engine start switches here are both set to off. And we will set the igniter to the right side if we are operating through a manned maintenance base. So if your airline has maintenance available at the airport where you currently are, keep in mind we're flying Ryanair here and we are in London Stansted. Yep, they definitely have maintenance here. We're going to set the right igniter. If we don't, we're going to use the left igniter. And if it's really cold outside, then you can set it to both to aid the engine start. APU as needed for the flight. Again, watch my earlier tutorials for an explanation when we are going to start the APU. And the taxi, turn-off and landing lights are all off and retracted, if we have retracts installed. From here on, we're moving down to the MCP, turn the flight directors on, and make sure that you're turning the side from which you are flying. So if you're flying from the captain's seat, the left-hand side, if you're flying from the first officer's seat, the right-hand side, on first. Because that is going to determine which side is the master side. You see this by the green master light illuminated here. And master side in the 737 basically determines which radio the autopilot is going to use. So if the left side is master, it's going to use the left course and the nav1 radio. If the right side is master, it's going to use the right course and the nav2 radio. Note that when you are engaging the autopilot, if it's in command A, the left side is always the master, in command B, the right side is always the master. Next up, we want to set our courses as we need them for our standard instrument departure. Looking at the departure, let's have a quick look at the charts. Again, those are Jeppesen charts I'm using here, provided to the flight sim community by Navigraph. And we are the flight from Stansted to Dublin. We have the Ottawa 1 Romeo departure over here. So after takeoff, we're going to the right and turn onto 350 Inmount Parkway. So that's our first turn. We're going to set 350 on the left course. Thereafter we'll join the radial 263 outbound Parkway. So we're going to set 263 on the right hand course. Make sure the speed is set to 100, that's the lowest possible value, and that's a clear indication for the pilots that we did not yet set our V2 speed on here. The heading should be set to the runway heading, so we can get that one from the chart as well. Runway 22, runway heading is 222 degrees. And we're going to set the altitude to our expected first cleared altitude plus 100 feet. Those plus 100 serve as a reminder that we have not yet received ATC clearance. So, if you are lining up on the runway, you see something like 4,100 set on the PFD, then you know, I need to confirm with air traffic control that we actually have received our initial climb clearance. Now we get this from the chart as well. We see our first restriction is between 3,000 and 4,000 feet, so 4,100 is what we're going to set. Moving on, reset the fuel flow to 0, make sure that it's actually resetting here, and then we're going to turn the auto brake to RTO, observe the disarm light illuminating for a second or two, and then it's going off. From there we are moving down to the thrust lever quadrant, speed brake is in the down detent, flap lever is up, and we are going to run a takeoff config check as well to make sure that the config system is working. Basically, you're pushing the thrust lever up above around the 70% N1 marking, and then you hear the intermittent horn coming on. That's the takeoff warning horn that we want to hear in this condition. Make sure the parking brake is set, engine start lever is cut off, and the step trim cutout switches are up and guarded. That's again an important step. You have those guards down here. Make sure they are actually up and the guards are closed. If any of these was set to the down position, the left one is disabling your main electric stabilizer trim. That's basically the trim you are steering through the button on the control column. And the right one is disabling the trim for the autopilot. If you're in a 737 MAX, both are doing basically the same thing. And if either of these is down, you will either not be able to trim the airplane or you will not be able to engage the autopilot. So making sure that they are up and guarded is quite important, even the switches are so well hidden. Moving down to the fire control panel, the overheat detector loops are both in the normal position and none of the switches is pulled. That brings us down to the pedestal. You can see again how it's once again split in 3 vertical parts here. So we're going to check them one by one. Tune the radio to whichever frequency is needed for your flight. So looking at our flight here, looking at the chart, we have delivery 121.955. And then we have ground on 121.73. Going further on to the radios, we have to look at our departure chart once again. So we're climbing straight ahead to 3.1 miles from the ILS 110.5, so we'll keep that active here. And then we're going to turn towards Barkway VOR, that's 116.25. So we'll put that in the standby. And then we'll set the opposite on the second radio for this very departure. So 116.25 is going active on the number 2. That means you have the DME indication and the needle available down here. Once you're airborne, on the ground it's probably not receiving the VOR yet, since it's some 20 kilometers-ish away from the airport. And then the ILS frequency in the standby. Further down, the audio control panel, we want to make sure that we're listening to the VHF1 radio. We want to be sure to listen to the flight interphone, and it's always a good practice to turn the speaker on as well. Make sure that the interphone switch is not on yet, so it's in the middle position. Otherwise, ground crew could hear everything that you are saying in the aircraft. The mask boom selector is set to boom. That is basically deciding if the tones you're saying is coming from your headset microphone and not from the microphone that's built into the oxygen mask over here. And finally, this is set to the middle position, and the alternate or normal selector is set to normal. If this was set to alternate, you could only transmit on the left radio over here, and you would severely limit the functions of the audio control panel. Next, set the ADF as needed. Make sure there is no cell call light illuminated. If it was, you couldn't just reset it by pressing on the associated button, and the lights are set as needed. Going on to the middle panel, we have the cargo fire detector loops both in normal. For the weather radar, it's in this first release, since Asobo does not yet provide the required data to developers, but if you're watching this at a later point, you would need to set it to the weather plus turbulence mode, so that the weather radar is not just indicating your weather, but also that it's indicating turbulence. The gain should be set to the middle position, and if it's in auto mode over here, which it is by default, then the tilt button is going to be disabled. Otherwise you'd have to use manual tilt. If you are using manual tilt, about 5 degrees upwards is a good setting for departure. Moving on to the transponder, make sure the standard squawk 2000 is set. It's in standby position, and if you are flying from the left hand seat, you want to put those both on system 1. If you are flying from the right hand seat, you would put them on system number 2. Make sure that the trims are centered, both here on the rudder trim indicator and on the elevator trim. You can see this on the control column by watching at the scale over here. And then we are quickly going to run a quick test to make sure that the trim is actually working. So, put the trim to the left, make sure this is moving, just very slightly, but that's all we need. And make sure that it's also moving to the right, and then return it to the center position. We're going to do the same with the ailerons. Left, you see how the control column deflected. Right. See the control column deflected to the right. Now return it to the center position. This sometimes takes a bit of fiddling here. You can make this easier if you just assign trim controls to your joystick. Okay, finally moving to the right hand side, we're going to set the emergency frequency 121.5. Active on the second radio. And then we can also set the frequency of the ATIS. So let's quickly have a look at that. ATIS frequency 127.180 on the standby radio. Alright, moving further down, we've already set the nav setup. For the FO's radio control panel, we're going to set it the very same as the captain's audio control panel. Make sure that the third radio is set to the data mode here. If it's not in data, like now, then you can put it into data by rotating it beyond the 118 point something position. So 118 point, then rotate it to the left, now it's showing data, and put the data mode active. The stabilizer trim normal override switch is guarded, and the flight deck door selector is in auto. And this concludes our pre-flight procedure. Thank you very much for watching. From here we are going to continue with the final CDU pre-flight procedure, and that is going to be in the next tutorial.